Hello everyone, Professor Kurzluck here. So when we study social movements and protest movements, or even just the emergence of one-off protests, one of the most intuitive explanations is also one of the oldest, one of the earliest theories on social movements. People rise up because they're suffering. It seems self explanatory, it seems intuitive. People are suffering, they protest. People are hurting economically, they protest. At first glance, this makes a lot of sense. If people are poor, oppressed, or excluded from the economic channels of power, surely they will protest. But political scientists, sociologists, have come to realize that this explanation is incomplete. Severe hardships exist in many places where no rebellion has occurred. Meanwhile, protests sometimes emerge or erupt in societies that are not experiencing extreme poverty or extreme economic conditions. So the question then becomes, what kind of deprivation actually produces political mobilization? So to answer this, scholars distinguish between absolute deprivation and relative deprivation. So absolute deprivation refers to concrete material suffering. So this includes things like lack of food, housing, lack of medical care, maybe extreme poverty, unsafe living conditions, or even chronic unemployment. In other words, absolute deprivation is about basic survival. It might seem obvious that people facing these conditions would protest, would engage in social movements, but empirically, this oftentimes doesn't happen. In fact, extreme deprivation can actually reduce protests. Empirical evidence has shown that these extreme conditions reduce protest activity. When people are struggling just to survive, they may lack the time, energy, resources, or organizational capacity to mobilize politically. Fear also plays a role. In very poor or repressive environments, challenging authority can feel too risky. Maybe you would lose that little bit that you're hanging on to. So, this leads to a rather important insight that absolute deprivation alone rarely produces sustained social movements. People who are more desperate often are the least able to organize. This pushes us towards a more subtle explanation. Relative deprivation theory. Relative deprivation shifts the focus away from material hardships and towards perception and comparison. Rather than asking whether people are poor, relative deprivation asks, do people feel they are being treated unfairly? Do they believe they deserve more than they are getting? Do they see others advancing while they are left behind? Have their expectations risen faster than their actual conditions? Relative deprivation is about the gap between what people think they should have and what they actually have. This gap creates anger, resentment, and a sense of injustice. Crucially, people compare themselves to other social groups, past generations, promises made by political leaders, images of prosperity through media. It is not about absolute misery that matters most. It's about perceived injustices. This is where Ted Gurr's classic work becomes central and relevant to our discussion. So, political scientist Ted Gurr developed one of the most influential theories of political violence and protest in his book, Why Men Rebel. Gurr argued that rebellion is driven primarily by relative deprivation. His core idea is simple, powerful, and long lasting. People become politically angry when they experience a gap between their value expectations, what they believe they deserve, and their value capabilities, what they can actually obtain. When this gap grows large, frustration builds. Gurr described several patterns of relative deprivation, but one is especially important for understanding protest movements, the J curve. This occurs when the society experiences a period of improvement, rising incomes, expanding rights, and growing opportunities, followed by a sudden downturn or stagnation. During the period of growth, expectations rise. When progress stalls or reverses, people don't just experience hardships, they experience loss. They feel something has been taken away from them. That emotional shift is politically explosive. Gurr emphasized that rebellion is not just about conditions, it is about expectations being violated. So, relative deprivation helps explain several puzzles. First, it explains why protests often emerge in societies that are modernizing, not collapsing. Second, it explains why movements frequently arise among people who are educated, urban, or politically aware, groups whose expectations tend to rise the fastest. Third, it helps explain why symbolic events can trigger mobilization. A corrupt election, police killing, or broken promises can suddenly crystallize long-standing frustrations. Relative deprivation also highlights the emotional dimensions of politics. Anger, humiliation, and resentment are not irrational forces. They are responses to perceived injustices. But Gurr also made clear that frustration alone is not enough, and we see this with other scholars who have layered other theories on top of deprivation theory. For rebellion to occur, people must also believe that action is possible. This connects relative deprivation to the broader theories of social movements that we've been talking about and that you've read about. Organization, political opportunity, and mobilizing structures still matter. Relative deprivation creates motivation, but movements still require capacity. So when we think of case studies where maybe deprivation matters, we can look within and outside of the U.S. So a powerful example of relative deprivation actually occurred outside of the U.S. context with the Arab Spring. Before 2011, many Middle Eastern countries were not experiencing sudden economic collapse. In fact, several had seen decades of gradual development. Education levels had risen, urban populations had grown, young people were more connected to the world through social media. Expectations increased, but political systems remained closed. Corruption persistent, youth unemployment was high, opportunities did not match expectations or aspirations. The spark came in Tunisia when a young street vendor set himself on fire after repeated harassment by government officials. This was not just about poverty, it was about dignity, exclusion, and blocked futures. Millions of people eventually across the region saw their own frustrations reflected in the moment. What followed was a classic case of relative deprivation meeting political opportunity. People were people were not the poorest in the world in these countries. They were people who felt promised that their futures had been denied. That sense of betrayal fueled mass mobilization. So, while relative deprivation is powerful, and scholars in 2011, scholars in 2008 brought relative deprivation theory back to the forefront, it does have its limits. Not everyone who feels deprived protests. Many people adapt. They withdraw from politics, or they cope privately. This is why modern social movement theories combine deprivation with organizational resources, political opportunities, leadership, and framing and identity. Relative deprivation explains why people care. It does not always fully explain why movements succeed or fail, though. Still, it remains quite foundational for our study and our research on social movements. So it reminds us that politics is not only about institutions, it is about lived experiences. So relative deprivation focuses on material hardship. Relative deprivation can focus on perceived injustices. Absolute focuses merely on that material hardship, while deprivation is on perceived injustice. Ted Gurr showed that rebellion emerges most often when rising expectations collide with blocked opportunities. People rebel not simply because they're poor, but because they feel cheated. They protest when they believe change is deserved, possible, and urgent. Relative deprivation helps us understand why protest movements often arise during moments of transition after progress, not during societal collapse. It explains why emotions matter, and it shows how deeply political mobilization is tied to dignity, hope, and disappointment. Understanding this theory gives us a powerful lens for analyzing protests, past and present, from civil rights struggles to student movements to global uprisings. So, although other theories have built upon relative deprivation theory, and many of the more recent theories kind of criticize relative deprivation as too simplistic an explanation and empirically not fulfilling, it is still worth us spending some time thinking about. Thank you.